games have gone down in history like that of Silent Hill 2, and it seems to be for good reason. The game was a smash hit when it released in 2001, and would go on to spawn a legacy that carried over into future games and even other content outside of its own medium. Many horror game enthusiasts cite Silent Hill 2 not only as their favorite game to play, but also as the most influential and most impactful horror game in the genre. Even the developers for the Resident Evil, Dead Space, and Amnesia franchises all attribute decisions made in the creation of their own games to the design tactics used in Silent Hill 2. When you have some of the biggest names in the industry touting your game as a major inspiration for them, you know you've done something extremely right. The developers that created the franchise, ingeniously named Team Silent, would take this acclaim to heart as they furthered their own repertoire, carrying their ideas and themes into more mainline titles and even some spin-offs before their publisher, Konami, dissolved the studio entirely and started licensing out the franchise to third-party developers. Since then, Silent Hill content has been in a bit of a lull. The last mainline title to release was that of Silent Hill Downpour, which came out on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in 2012. That is until just recently, when Konami began hinting at a resurgence of the franchise. In October of 2022, multiple new projects based in the series lore were announced, including Silent Hill Ascension, an interactive media collaboration game where the viewers of a real-time presentation would make choices for the protagonist of the show by voting on what decisions to make throughout the campaign. Another title, this time in the mainline franchise's lore, was also revealed, titled Silent Hill F, set in 1950s Japan and being developed by Neobards, a Japanese video game studio who had their hands in the development of Onimusha Warlords, Resident Evil Reverse, and most recently the remastering of Dead Rising. Even a new movie was teased, starring Jeremy Irvine and Hannah Emily Anderson. It was described as a psychological horror film, adapting the story of Silent Hill 2 to live action. And just this year, in January, a brand new, fully complete title was launched for free on the PlayStation 5 called The Short Message, to pretty decent reception. Konami was obviously testing the waters, looking to see who, if anyone, would be interested in the revival of this near-dead franchise. It was a welcome sight, as many fans have been calling for any kind of new game since the mixed reviews of Downpour so long ago. Team Silent no longer exists as a studio, and since its liquidation, other developers have been given a shot at the franchise. This led to a variety of different interpretations of what made those games great in the first place, and each of these were received with both positive and negative opinions from fans and critics alike. But perhaps the biggest gamble to date rests within the announcement of the most hotly anticipated title from Konami in recent history. At the end of their October 2022 broadcast, a revelation was made. Bloober Team, the developers behind Layers of Fear, Medium, and Blair Witch, would be developing a full top-to-bottom remake of Silent Hill 2. Completely new character models, a redesigned town map, an overhauled combat system, re-recorded voice lines with new actors, and a newly orchestrated soundtrack, all with the collaboration of former staff from Team Silent. To say that the audience was shocked was an understatement. Since 2012, the fate of the franchise was kind of up in the air. Many creative projects pitched for approval, lay in pieces on the cutting room floor, and after the fiasco that was Silent Hills, with Kojima and Del Toro, it seemed like the fog would never break upon the desolate little town ever again. But the project was confirmed, and new information rolled out steadily over time. The remake would be to launch on the PS5 on the 8th of October 2024, with the PC port slated for release just a year later. Fan reaction was immense, rightfully skeptical, but the buzz was astonishing. Konami could not screw this up, otherwise they'd be dealing with incredible fallout and even more negative press attached to the Silent Hill name. Time went on, and more footage from reveal trailers and tech demos made their rounds on the internet, and interviews from staff currently and formerly associated with the franchise were broadcast. Needless to say, the hype was real, and people were pining for a modern interpretation of this incredibly monumental game. But the thing is, I can't entirely understand all of this praise. To me, there isn't a complete picture here, because while I understand Silent Hill is a name to be respected, and I've even played and watched others talk about most of these games, I have never actually played Silent Hill 2 until recently. Most of what I know about the franchise is secondhand knowledge. I've only ever actually played the first game. I remember reading reviews and seeing ads for the third game. I played the demo for the fourth one, and I've seen Let's Players go through Shattered Memories and Downpour, but really, that's about it. My experience with the second game was incredibly limited. I've watched a few others do video essays on it, and when I posed the question, what is your ideal horror narrative, to a few of my friends, most of the time I got hit with something like, Silent Hill 2 is peak horror narrative. So I figured enough was enough. The remake comes out soon, and I haven't even basked in the glory of the original, so now is as good a time as any to get my hands dirty. I'm going into this fairly blind, mind you. Yes, I've seen the GamingBritShows and TotallyPointlessTV analysis videos, but I haven't had the pleasure of actually immersing myself in this world yet, and surrounding myself in its mysteries. There is a huge difference between somebody telling you how to solve a puzzle and actually getting to go through and solve the puzzle by yourself, so that's what I'm going to do. Through every dark hallway and every horrible memory, I've decided to find out for myself if Silent Hill 2 holds up after all of these years. So, a bit of context before I begin the breakdown of this game. The version of Silent Hill 2 that I played for this video is the Xbox port, released 3 months after the PS2 version in December of 2001. This version of the game is titled Silent Hill 2 Restless Dreams, and it contains just a bit of extra content than the original. Along with a prologue campaign where you play as the character of Maria, the game also contains a few extra toggles in the option menu, as well as some graphical and mechanical bug fixes. I wanted to be clear on that, just in case somebody tries pointing out any changes that they don't remember being there in the game when they played through it themselves. I only played through the story one time as to keep my original feelings fresh for when I wrote this script, and didn't go back to play the Maria campaign. I probably will at a later point, maybe squeezing out 1 or 2 more playthroughs before the remake drops. Also, I did everything in my power not to use a guide for this video. I played this game only at night with headphones on, and the experience was immaculate. If there are a few times where I've paused for a bit, or you see me running around, just know that it wasn't exclusively because I needed long shots for video content, but it was actually me trying to avoid progressing in the game because I was actually unnerved. When I set up my first run through this game, I chose the normal difficulty for both puzzles and combat, as to not overwhelm myself, but also not to skew the experience toward being too easy. I also went with the original control scheme. I abhor tank controls, but after a little while learning to play this game, I completely understood why Silent Hill 2 works the way that it does. This game is oozing with artistic vision. It makes a lot of creative design choices in its presentation and also in its execution. Almost the entire game is set up with a specific camera angle, especially in claustrophobic rooms and hallways. The camera will be tilted or peek at the player from awkward positions. In one room, you might manage to make it over your character's shoulder, but the second you walk through a door or climb a ladder to a new position, the camera swings around and is actually pointed at the character's front side, or looking up at them from their ankles, or in the corner of a room watching them from afar, or behind a wall or window. This type of presentation is articulate and very creative, and gives a lead into the developer's mind as to what they're trying to show, or hide, from the player. You focus on what they want you to, and you have no choice in the matter. But this also makes it extremely difficult to navigate the levels in a traditional way. The tank controls here mitigate this by making sure the only way the player can move is forward, and any other input is made solely to turn the player in a different direction. It was an adjustment for the first few hours, but I'm glad that I played it this way. The main gameplay of Silent Hill 2 is focused on two different halves: solving puzzles using clever riddles and scattered items in an area, and fighting enemies with melee and ranged weapons found throughout the campaign. Combat in Silent Hill 2 is ugly. There are monstrous creatures throughout every part of this town, ranging from armless cripples that spit acid to lumbering flesh-infused hospital beds, and they all make grotesque sounds at you as they approach. The player enters this town without a single weapon at all, but will slowly build an arsenal by the end of their little journey of self-discovery here. Players will pick up a plank of wood with nails in it, ripped from a construction scaffold, a lead pipe, a hard-hitting beat stick with good range, found jammed into the hood of a car somebody left at a gas station. Each gun that the player gets is supplied with its own ammunition, found scattered around the town, and the way the game is designed, all ammo is in limited quantities. Once you've collected all the ammo for a gun in the entire game, and go through all of it in the last moments, that's it. They don't drop from enemies, and you can't open crates or chests for more. Scary, but I found that by the end of the game, I had ammunition for each weapon in the hundreds, so there was little fear of running out in the final boss gauntlet. Players can find a standard M92F Beretta handgun, which is accurate and packs a decent punch, and is the weapon that I used the most throughout the game. There's a shotgun found in the second floor locker room of the hospital, which is insane, but fine. It's got a wide range and is the go-to for boss killing. I used it a handful of times to get out of being surrounded by monsters, and by the end was carrying it around like I did the handgun in the beginning. And finally, there's the hunting rifle, which is a super precise, super powerful weapon that I used exclusively for the final few boss encounters. It's incredibly accurate at long range, but the firing rate is terrible. I was only ever able to get a couple of shots off before I was attacked by the enemies myself, which I felt dragged out encounters that could have been over in just a few minutes. Overall, combat encounters in Silent Hill 2 will fall into one of two groups. You're either firing at disgustingly horrible monsters just off screen so they don't get too close to you, or you're running back and forth to opposite corners of a room while you pop off a few shots at a boss. When exploring the town and the buildings within the town, the player will have to either avoid or take out creatures that have seemingly replaced the denizens of Silent Hill. Each of these things are meant to represent some fear or memory the player character is struggling with, and as such they are relentless in their approach. In most cases, when you're wandering the town, you can simply run past them to get to where you need to go. But in the closed hallways and rooms of the buildings, you're more often gunning them down to get through. Nearly all bosses in this game are fought in the same way. Their encounters are within these tightly cramped spaces places, so you're only able to really get a hit or two in before they've reached you and forced you to take off to avoid being grappled or attacked. Much like the combat mechanics in this game, solving riddles and navigation puzzles in Silent Hill 2 takes a little bit of additional work. While exploring the town is a major gameplay feature, most of the time there's an obvious roadblock of some sort that needs to be bypassed in order to progress the campaign. Because of this, the player is drilled into taking care of a map during their playthrough almost the entire time. The player character we take control of doesn't live in this town. In fact, he's almost a stranger to everything here, save for the time he once brought his wife here for vacation. As such, he, and by extension we, the players, have no idea where we're going at all times. The town itself is fairly easy to get through. There's a neighborhood to the south, a highway that connects with the other side of the lake, and the hotel resort that acts as our character's landmark. But throughout the other sections of the game, such as when we're navigating an apartment complex or a prison ward, an interior map is posted for us to acquire and is regularly updated automatically as we explore. This is perhaps the most used function in the whole game, so I hope you know how to read a compass. Part of this game's, and the others in the franchise's, charm is that the town of Silent Hill is almost always covered in a thick, blinding fog. The town itself has been long abandoned as well, so the buildings are rarely lit in any capacity. This means that the player will have to pay attention to where exactly they are by taking note of things like signage, landmarks, and more often than not, their map. The player character will automatically update the map with new information, such as locked doors, impassable paths, and other places of interest. Your position is also always available too, so if you think you've become lost, or you can't find your own way back using the environment, you can always consult this thing, which I did a lot. This game is incredibly dark. Silent Hill 2 also likes to challenge its players intellectually as well as physically during its campaign, as the other gameplay components rely on solving mysterious riddles and puzzles throughout the story. Some of these will be fairly mild, such as adjusting a grandfather clock to match a password where three people's names whose first initial correlates to the hour, minute, and second hands on the clock face. Or in another, a music box in the lobby of the hotel needs to be tuned using three smaller boxes decorated with the Little Mermaid, Snow White, and Cinderella. The plaque on the music box describes each slot with the princess that belongs there, and after reading them, you understand that you only really needed a surface level understanding of the fairy tales to complete this puzzle. However, to add some replayability to the game, the player is given the option to change the puzzle difficulty at the beginning of the campaign. This decision can fundamentally alter the entire playing experience, as players will be given new criteria for completing certain puzzles, changing the locations of items and other collectibles for the many fetch quests in the game. I played on the normal difficulty for puzzles, and let me tell you, trying to figure out how the wax doll and this horseshoe fits together for a puzzle was absolutely asinine. Taking a step back to analyze the gameplay of this game was kind of fun, because despite some of its aged mechanics, it really was easy to fall into the rhythm of what Silent Hill 2 was trying to sing to me. You see a lot of the old blood that horror games are typically built out of nowadays. The game provides the player with a decent sized map, and each location that you're given to explore is just as intricate. The map design is great, forcing the player to explore to find out which rooms are locked, which rooms are important, and which rooms just have basic supplies. It gives the player a reason to go looking for the way forward, and trapping them with the consequences of guessing wrong when it inevitably happens. Combat in this game is a bit sloppy, but it's effective. The player character is just supposed to be a regular guy, lost in this awful place and forced to do battle with terrifying monsters as he searches for the answers to his complicated problems. He isn't a combat veteran, and he doesn't have high-powered tools at his disposal. He's just a traumatized man with a shotgun, staring down the face of a butt-ugly bag of flesh, trying not to get eviscerated. So when he awkwardly winds up for a blow with the plank, or is forced to shakily take aim with a hunting rifle, it's easily justified, if maybe a bit tedious. My only complaint is that the controls on the Xbox controller were a bit too broad and simplified. There are more buttons to hit with your fingers on the PS2 controller, which this game was made for. If there was a bit more variety in the combat mechanics, especially with the melee weapons, I think I could say I was satisfied here. Also, finding out where items were hidden, as well as discovering uses for items you didn't really think had a place in the puzzle, was pretty intricate and definitely forced me to have to think about how to proceed on several occasions. Silent Hill 2 is hardly a straightforward game, and they don't give you a lot of information that often. The player will be strung along with points of interest on their map of the area, where the save points are, and by examining items in their inventory, are given subtle clues and references to other events going on in the game. It all feels very intentional, save for maybe a few, which I found out during my research are common gripes people had with this game since its release. Needing to have a second person help open this refrigerator to continue during the nightmare hospital was one of them, as well as the amazing combination of a wax candle, a lighter, and a horseshoe to fashion a makeshift handle for this basement latch, which was incredibly baffling. So was this moment in the hotel basement, having to use a can opener to crack open this soup can, only to discover it was filled with light bulbs, which you need to install into a lamp to illuminate a door handle so you can unlock it with a key. Solving the written riddles was pretty fun though. In a lot of these, you kind of just have to read the notes given to you and interpret them according to the game's story and its themes. Some of them were definitely more literal than others, like the Hanged Man's puzzle towards the end of the labyrinth. It must have been a difficult battle for the developers to keep these kinds of riddles easy enough to solve for the general masses, but also make them more intricate on harder difficulties, which I can appreciate the effort on. While Silent Hill 2 tends to play like a typical survival horror game from the 2000s, the part of the game that everybody continues to hold in high regard is its subtle, layered narrative. Most games in this franchise carry with them a dark and moody atmosphere, supported by sensitive subject matter that ranges anywhere from the disturbing sides of humanity to the dangerously occult. In the first game, Harry Mason's daughter is kidnapped by a demonic cult, attempting to summon their idol. In the third game, that daughter returns to annihilate the cult and learn the truth of her origins. In the fourth game, Henry Townsend moves into an apartment complex that's been tied to a serial killer born into the terrible ancient traditions of the town. Silent Hill 2, however, steps away from the paranormal and instead zooms in on the human psychology, about how their brains interpret fear and traumatic responses. Each of the named characters in this story, that being James, Mary, Maria, Angela, Eddie, and Laura, are all called to this town due to an event, or events, in their lives that have caused them some kind of suffering. This suffering takes on many wicked forms and plagues each of them to their core, and how they struggle through their suffering is the bread and butter of the narrative of this game. Silent Hill 2's story tells itself through the perspective of a man named James Sunderland, a quiet guy who doesn't typically involve himself in the affairs of friends and strangers alike. His wife, Mary, was a kind-hearted person who cared for others and tried to help them as often as possible. They had a happy relationship for many years before Mary was inflicted with an incurable disease, which then transformed them both emotionally and mentally. Mary passed away, and after 3 years of solitude, finding it difficult to move on, James receives a letter in the mail written to him by his dead wife. She invites him to their special place in the town of Silent Hill so that they might reconnect somehow. Desperate enough to defy all reason, James travels to the town in hopes of finding his lost love. During his travels through the town, James meets a few other people who are seemingly called here as well, including Angela Orozco, a 19-year-old girl who has come to the town in search of her mother. Also wandering around town is a man named Eddie Dombrowski, a fella a bit on the larger side, who seems to have been caught up in a string of violence as he makes his way through Silent Hill. James also stumbles upon Laura, a little 8-year-old girl who claims to have some sort of relationship with Mary. Though she refuses to be of much help to us in the beginning, it's slowly unveiled to James that she had a deeper connection with his wife than he initially caught on to. Lastly, James meets a woman named Maria, a near identical twin to James's wife, save for the outfit and the makeup. She accompanies James unexpectedly in his search through the town for Mary, giving just a bit of strange companionship in this dark, desolate place. With these characters as the game's instruments, Silent Hill 2 attempts to play a symphony of themes revolving around grief, love, guilt, and abuse. Many of the characters have a direct connection to mental illness, but what's special about this game at its core is that it isn't presented in a straightforward way. Like, there isn't a memo or an audio log or something that declares Eddie as a sociopath or schizophrenic, but these are diagnoses that could apply to the character and give a bit of inflection on his behavior. The player also doesn't spend the entire game surrounded by these people either. While James is undertaking his own journey through Silent Hill, the other characters here are as well, meaning that every time they encounter one another, each has progressed further along their own paths. At many junctures, after James has encountered a revelation, or even just acquired new information, he will come across someone like Laura, who gives him an additional goal to seek, or Maria will show up, who is able to open new routes for him to explore as he contemplates his own thoughts and feelings. The other major characters, Eddie and Angela, are used in juxtaposition to James's well-being as it's being tested. It's quickly discovered that Eddie is an aggressive, dismissive man who would rather finish a situation off with a gunshot and not bother asking questions later. Angela has the opposite problem, running from every confrontation and fleeing with a scream when she's approached. James, however, has always been very isolated, and has seemingly only ever opened up to his wife Mary about his feelings. The addition of characters like Angela and Eddie are here to show the player the extremes in either direction, and the severity they possess if taken too far by a single person. James himself manifests his problems through the appearance of the many monsters that attempted to do him harm throughout his tour of the town. Each of these abominations were specifically designed by the developers to invoke a certain memory or feeling, resonating with the story of James and his wife that's fed to the player in tiny pieces throughout the game. The lying figures, the most common enemy in the game, are these stumbling creatures with their hands bound over their chests and spewing vile acid to attack, and are perhaps meant to represent a vicious form of Mary herself, a bound and suffering person who can only communicate by using harsh oral methods. The bubblehead nurses, these attractive medical attendants adorned with standard nurse garb, though with highly revealing tops and impressively heeled shoes, and are meant to represent James's frustrating desires, never being sated with his wife having been sick and unavailable for an extended period of time. The game's titular recurring antagonist, Pyramid Head, which is this massive, grimy looking hulk of a man with a large rusted iron prism mounted on top of his head, was formed out of James's guilt-fueled hunger for punishment. He'd later go on to become an icon for the franchise, even used as a mascot when branching out into other media. Each of the monsters, boss encounters or otherwise, play a crucial role in the unraveling of the enigma that is James Sunderland. Players will begin James's trip to Silent Hill in a bathroom on the observation deck above Toluca Lake, examining himself in the mirror and questioning his own motives. He's been called here by a letter from his dead wife, which leans on the impossible. Why would Mary be reaching out with a letter of all things? How could a dead person even send a letter? All we know is that James is desperate enough to see his wife again, and has thus found himself searching an abandoned town for her. Upon arriving at Silent Hill, players will quickly note that the streets are empty. Not a single living soul is present in the stores, traveling the roads, or hanging out in the public facilities. Empty cars lay motionless on and off the street, and many of the buildings have fallen into disrepair. Massive environmental hazards, such as these massive sinkholes along roadways and bridges, block many of the straightforward routes through the town. James is forced to take unusual paths and shortcuts to get from one place to another, cutting through apartment buildings and digging up property to find keys to new locations. One could say that Silent Hill itself is almost like an organism, with various winding paths taking you through the heart and mind of the town as it attempts to send you on your way. After James's first encounter with a lying figure, the creatures of the dark begin to stalk the streets, looking for prey. They come from everywhere, sometimes found just stumbling through the fog, but others will creep out from under cars, lunge from alleyways, and even get thrown onto the road from the woods should the player wander too far from town. Each location the player visits is designed in a way to bring additional context to certain characters' mindsets and where their trauma resides. The first major locations, the Woodside and Blue Creek apartments, are fairly straightforward, demonstrating how significant events in a person's life can follow them to their own home, meaning that they're never truly safe. When James arrives at the Brookhaven Hospital, he's bombarded with subliminal imagery that aggressively depicts the horrible disease that tormented Mary, and the things it made her say and broke her into. Other settings, such as the terribly confusing Labyrinth or the climactic Lakeview Hotel, tend to layer on additional context clues in subtle ways. Navigating the Labyrinth, for example, is incredibly tough, but logistically impossible. The entrance to this place is hidden behind a massive staircase that goes deep into the earth and past several straight down pits where you're forced to jump through in order to proceed. When all said and done, you're able to exit out of the back of a meat refrigerator and somehow wind up directly behind the Historical Society building at a boat dock. How did we go down all that way just to walk through the back door of a building? Was James able to navigate distances while he was unconscious? Did the labyrinth even exist at all? At the Lakeview Hotel, we enter the building in seemingly pristine condition despite the time frame that James has been away. When we're done there, the building itself morphs into a downtrodden state. Much of the furniture has fallen into disrepair, and flames have scorched many of the walls throughout the hallways of this place. So is this the nightmare version, like at the hospital? Or was it always like that, and we just tricked ourselves to believe in the inverse? This town's seemingly cursed existence functions as a sort of purgatory, trapping people running from the darkness within themselves and forcing them to confront their inner torment. A person might defeat the shadows and emerge a changed being, having been through the worst of it and conquered their insecurities. But more often than not, these people are unable to change, consumed by their feelings of doubt and hatred. Eddie and Angela, the other two adults who've been brought to Silent Hill, fall victim to themselves despite the town and James's interference. Eddie grew up ostracized for being overweight and maybe a little bit dense. It caused him to foster a bitter hatred for people, and when he grew to a certain age, he began lashing out at people and even animals who did so little as look at him the wrong way. His way of conquering his insecurities has evolved into full-blown psychopathy, turning him into a cold, heartless being. Just like the frigid, bleak meat freezer, we're forced to take him on within. Angela, on the other hand, has no forward will of her own. She's been abused and manipulated her entire adolescence, and it shows in her meek conversation skills. Angela constantly apologizes and mulls over her reasoning for having come to Silent Hill in the first place. She says she's looking for her mother, but she's been looking for her in the cemetery. Later on, in the apartment complex, she's found sulking by a mirror with a knife, changing her story and personality on a razor's edge. Angela is now moody and distracted, seemingly having brought her focus to some other purpose entirely. She'll revert to her childish behavior, but only after being confronted on her intentions. In her last appearance in Lakeview Hotel, surrounded by the fires of her anguished past, Angela has fully given in to the grief and despair. She's been a victim almost her entire life, and has been forced to endure it until now. She's confronted her losses and agony, but she was unable to overcome it. James sees into the flames and watches as they consume her. Angela believed she deserved her torment, but the truth is, it was never her fault to begin with. Silent Hill 2 goes to many lengths to establish a through line with themes presented visually and subliminally. Like, there's obvious representation of certain concepts going on in each character's journey. James feels regret for how he treated Mary in her final days, and that desire to find a new purpose or some kind of repentance is what draws him into the town. This desire for change and new answers is shared by that of Angela, who looks for a reason, any reason really, as to why she was forced to endure in her childhood. When she finds that spark and is released from her torment, it carries over into Eddie's inspiration as well. They've found the answers to their questions and changed from their battered and bruised selves. It's these characters and their transformations, bound by their traumas and haunted pasts, combined with the abysmal nature and lore of the setting, that provide for the excellent narrative that this game is so widely known for and critically acclaimed. And I think it's deservedly so, in my humble opinion. Since its release in 2001, few horror games have been able to replicate the sheer magnitude of success that Silent Hill 2 has been able to garner. Back then, and even now, this game was given praise not only as a video game, but as a piece of art in general. Upon release, game critics complimented not only the narrative, but the sheer graphical fidelity of a first-year title for the PS2. The game earned an 89 out of 100 on Metacritic and received a 7.7 out of 10 at GameSpot and a 9 out of 10 at IGN. Jeff Lundgren from Next Generation Video Game Magazine said, quote, "It's not for the faint of heart, and those who enjoy a good shiver won't be disappointed." Doug Perry from IGN said in his review, quote, "It's frightening, deep, clever, and tries to improve the genre. As time went on and more games came out in the franchise, most look upon Silent Hill 2 as a diamond in the rough, something separate from others in the continuity, yet holding up the backbone of the entire series. Games Radar listed the game among its top 15 of the best video game stories ever told in 2008. In 2009, IGN suggested the game as one of the 12 best PS2 games of all time. In 2010, GamePro listed Silent Hill 2 as the 26th best game for the console as well. And as recently as 2014, in Game Informer's October issue, the magazine listed Silent Hill 2 as the second best horror video game of all time. When you cruise the internet for spooky, scary skeletons content, it's almost impossible not to find somebody willing to talk about this game, or at least add it into their list. Silent Hill 2 sits on the shelf with the greatest when it comes to horror games, and they all cite each other as major inspirations for their work, and attribute their success to the roads laid before them by their predecessors. Silent Hill 2 is just one of those games, man. You can find a dozen or two analysis videos or character breakdowns, now including this one, and still learn new information about the game, or even find new interpretations of the content that's already been researched over and over again. Many will highlight this game as the best in the franchise, pointing out the deeply layered story being told indirectly throughout the entirety of the game. It's also complemented by just how fun it is to play the game. When I approached making this video, I became aware of this stigma associated with Silent Hill 2, where I believed that unless I was coming at this game from a hyper-analytical point of view, I wouldn't be able to enjoy the game properly. That if I didn't try to become a psychologist and memorize and interpret every word said by a character, or jot down every footnote found throughout the playthrough, that I'd somehow be doing this game and this community a disservice of some sort. But I can say now without a shadow of a doubt that just like every other piece of media available for the Xbox and PS2, Silent Hill 2 is a completely enjoyable product as a standalone video game. So does Silent Hill 2 still hold up today? In trying to be in line with the theme of this video, and the game I'm talking about as subject matter, the answer is of course going to be a bit of a mixed bag. I know, that's an annoying thing to say, but let me explain. Silent Hill 2 was developed in the early beginnings of the 6th generation of consoles. The PS2 released in North America in October of the year 2000, and Silent Hill 2 was released in September of 2001. The technology was still foreign to many game developers at this point, and so Team Silent were essentially leading the charge on what the devices were capable of. Many of Silent Hill 2's visuals are incredibly dated, with fuzzy, grainy textures throughout every surface. Water is just completely invisible unless it's got something in it, and the lighting is only stand out when it's being focused on. Yet, the character animations are believable, and facial detail is way above what others were coming up with at this time. Looking at you, Metal Gear Solid 2. The game's presentation in unorthodox camera angles and the melodic, emotional soundtrack are impressive, though sometimes you wish they just went for a bit more compromise on the climactic events with the loud horn and electric guitar stings. Gameplay-wise, the game is pretty clunky and a bit difficult to control. Tank controls are always a pain in the ass, but this game doesn't function nearly as well without them. Combat encounters are slow and feels unfair at times, but it's balanced out by the context from which you engage in them in the first place. The game is also just paced tremendously well, with significant events that break up the traditional gameplay happening often, but not reaching a fever pitch until the climax of the chapter. You're constantly tense as you explore, and that tension is released when you face down a burly, creepy monster bullying somebody in an enclosed space. Overall, I have a pretty positive opinion of this game. I think the characters are well written, the dialogue is strange but intriguing, the level design itself is pretty standard, though I wish more doors were unlocked for more exploration. A fair amount of risk and reward involving your supplies is present throughout the whole game, with most groups of 2 or more monsters hiding some kind of item or ammunition, which I can appreciate. The puzzle design was also pretty on point, with all but the innocent hanged man puzzle being solved in a decent amount of time. I never felt stuck in one place for too long, and whenever I got a game over, I believed it was only ever my fault, not that of the game's. In fact, during my playthrough of the labyrinth portion of the game, I saved only one time in the beginning, just at the foot of the elevator before you go into it. I didn't save after I got the wire cutters, I didn't save before or after the abstracted daddy boss battle, not because I thought I could handle the whole chapter, but strictly because I just wasn't looking for save squares after major events. So when I got to the Eddie encounter and misread the amount of damage he dealt with a punch to the gut and died, I had to start the entire chapter all over again. I was confused and furious because the abyssal labyrinth can go to hell, but I knew it was my fault and only my fault for getting careless in my environment inspection. At the end of the day, I feel comfortable giving this game a solid 8.5 out of 10. It's not flawless by any means, and many parts of the game feel kinda dated by today's standards, but the experience is incredible if you commit to a somewhat blind run, meaning without a guide, and allow yourself to try and figure this game out as you play it. The narrative is captivating, and the gameplay is definitely fun and challenging when it's supposed to be. I recommend it to anybody who has neglected to play it already, or maybe revisit it to get it fresh in your mind again, especially before the remake comes out and gives you a different interpretation of the work. At the end of my playthrough, I received the in water ending, saved the game 33 times, spent 6.5 hours in the campaign, picked up 237 items, shot 6 enemies to death, stomped another 83 into the concrete, took 1.5 minutes to cross Toluca Lake, and got 11 stars as my final rank. Does Silent Hill 2 hold up today? To be honestly fair, yes. Yes, I think it does. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I think that just about does it for me. Thanks for tuning in. Let me know what you thought about my view on the game, and tell me about your favorite moment in Silent Hill 2 in the comments below. Also consider subscribing to receive more videos like this one in the future, and drop a like if you liked what you saw here today. And as always, don't forget to stay awesome, be kind and rewind, and have a wonderful night. Excelsior!